So I'm curious, Mike, if do you really see a possibility with the current two-party system where the primaries are often decided by the most extreme of the party candidates because they're catering to the base? You're not seeing perhaps what the stereotype argument now is, that it's becoming more polarized. You're actually seeing something of a move to the middle from both sides.
I do think you're starting to see that. I genuinely do. And I could be wrong on that. I hope I'm right, but I could be wrong. Like, I just can't emphasize that enough, right? And I would broadly say that increasingly everyone within both parties is recognizing that much of the behavior was performative, right? Support for Trump and the dynamics of Trumpism and, the enjoyment of DeSantis's behavior, et cetera, feels like it's retreating. Feels like people are saying, you know what, that was probably a little bit too much. Right.
Let me follow up with the Economist is doing an interesting coverage of the upcoming midterms and talking about how elected officials in the states, particularly in red states, the more moderate Republicans are being replaced with the Trump candidates, and particularly the officials that would be validating elections are coming in with the narrative of the stolen election of 2020. And so the concern is that 2024, we're coming into a even larger crisis because of the potential for an actual stealing of an election now to the other side. Have you been following these events at all? How does that square with your take?
So I would broadly argue, again, that we tend to focus on the last war, right? So effectively, I would argue we're trying to construct a Maginot Line against something that I would argue is not going to actually be particularly an effective approach. I can't guarantee that, because again, this is a relatively hopeful observation in a morass of really bad policy-making choices. And it's one of the reasons that I'm so frightened of the behavior of the Federal Reserve, because the clearly conventional wisdom is, well, we're going to have a recession, but it's going to be really mild, right? Man, I struggle. That frightens me more than anything else, because recessions are inherently chaotic activities, right? Things get restructured in ways that we can't predict. It could be the case, right? I can certainly see how that happens. I can also see how we enter into an environment in which there's an extraordinary degree of hysteresis, and the human capital skills that people have developed are replaced by a significant diminution of that, right? I mean, we're going into a recession with unemployment programs woefully unprepared, state finances woefully unprepared, household balance sheets for the majority of U.S. households, in an extraordinarily weak framework. We're looking at things like credit card debt that is non-dischargeable. We're looking at a high probability that the Biden administration's attempt to eliminate student loan debt fails, and suddenly people who thought that they had dropped $20,000 worth of debt find that not only do they have that $20,000 worth of debt, but it's now non-dischargeable.
Interests are higher
immediately, right? It's reset higher because of accumulated it. Think about the potential that we're looking at here. And everyone's saying, boy, if we just have a recession, then that's really going to hurt Ken Griffin. I guarantee you that Ken Griffin could care less.
He's going to be fine.
Ken Griffin is an interesting example, right? It's clearly hurting the oligarchs that are the primary shareholders of the FANGs, for example, right? You're hurting.
Wait a second. When you say it's clearly hurting, right? I mean, while Jack Dorsey may look like a homeless man, I have not yet seen him on a street corner collecting quarters.
Agreed. Impairing, not devastating, but it's definitely we're balancing some of those things. I guess my point is what is your recommendation that we should continue with the same types of looser monetary policy that we embraced from, and again, notwithstanding 2009, but from the sort of 2012 to 2021 period, in the face of continued gridlock at the state political level and the national political level that is unlikely to unleash the types of other policies that we need to see in order to move in a more productive direction for the majority of Americans. It's one thing if there's some optimism that some of the ossification that we're observing in terms of political decision making is becoming more productive. But I think in the short term, it's hard to argue that, right? So if we can't count on government to make different decisions, then does the Fed really have a choice? Is your recommendation that we should have continued with the same kinds of loose or stimulative monetary policies because we can't count on government to step in and do the right thing?
Well, again, I think you're drawing a distinction between the Fed and government that is false, right? It's the financing arm of the U.S. government.
Okay.
So to treat it as a separate political entity, I think, is a false distinction. What you're really saying is, should the Fed, an unelected body, sit by and pass judgment on the terrible policies that we have allowed to persist in our political system? And I don't see how they possibly have that authority.
But they did that from 2012 to 2021.
Again,
just in the opposite direction.
I'm not defending those choices, but two wrongs do not make a right. Had the Fed decided at any point we actually saw this behavior, right? We saw what happened when the Fed repeatedly tried to hike interest rates and then backed off because they were incapable of seeing the system through, right? The persistence and the reliance on the dynamic of the Fed responding under any conditions got worse and worse and worse and worse, right? So the easiest thing for the Fed to do is to say, you know what, first thing we're going to do is cause no harm. We're going to adopt effectively the Hippocratic Oath that says we're not going to actually try to change economic outcomes ourselves.
But
right?
No action from zero rates is an action.
What's up?
No action, or just maintaining the status quo with extreme policy is an action.
Again, the dynamics of the extreme policy that were put in place in the pandemic, they absolutely should have withdrawn components of that. There was no reason to be providing significant support to the housing market once it was clear that the pandemic emergency was in place. But remember what the Fed actually did, right? The Fed lowered interest rates by roughly 75 basis points, right, on mortgages, which, while material, remember that if you're in a fixed rate 30-year mortgage, you're still paying back the principal. So all you're doing is reducing the interest component of it, give or take on a $300,000 home. It takes your payment from roughly $2,700 a month to somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,400 a month. Yes, that's an improvement, but no, that is not driving a 30% increase in home prices, right? The second thing that the Fed does is that when the Fed lowers those interest rates, it facilitates a refinancing and a liquefaction of savings from those who are already locked into paying $2,700 a month, allowing them to obtain an additional $300 a month in income. If they sell their home and they liquefy a component of the gains in capital gains component, bully for them, that's fantastic, but then they have to go out and find additional housing, right? So there's not really much of a trade that's underway there unless you're willing to significantly take a step down and take cash out, and that's always going to happen in every cycle, right? So the actual value that the Fed was able to bring into that process was in an environment in which unemployment spiked to 20% for a brief period of time and tremendous amounts of economic uncertainty existed. We facilitated the fleeing to the countryside that has accompanied every pandemic in history, right? We had a choice. We could either say to people, nope, you can't move anywhere because no bank is going to finance you. Or we can say, you know what, we're going to step in and we're going to facilitate this transition. if you really want to get out, if you really want to have a place to educate your children, if you really want to have a place to work from home, we're going to actually make that possible for you. And you actually see this in the purchase data, which had a very minor step up, in part because, as Logan and others point out, there was simply a lack of available inventory that does show up in higher prices. People made bad choices around that, and there would have been a natural retreat from it, right? But to engage in a substantive and intentional punitive behavior in which you're then turning around and saying, okay, we're going to trap these people in their homes and their mortgages for an extended period of time and reduce the capacity of the economy to restructure itself by hiking interest rates, right? And reducing that capacity for a fundamental restructuring strikes me as absurd policy in an environment in which you're trying to accomplish everything that you're saying.